A single wrong step can change a life forever, but only if the heart is brave enough to keep walking. At exactly 8:42 on a rainy Tuesday morning, Ethan Brooks adjusted the worn backpack hanging from one shoulder while his 8-year-old daughter Lily held tightly to his hand, her tiny rain boots leaving little watermarks across the polished marble floor of Hayes Global Tower. The towering glass lobby shimmered beneath soft white lights, where executives hurried past in tailored suits carrying steaming coffee and conversations worth millions of dollars. Yet no one noticed the father whose jacket had been carefully stitched twice at the elbow, or the little girl smiling up at him, as though he were the richest man in America. Ethan wasn't supposed to be there. A maintenance contractor had called in sick, and, after accepting one extra shift to cover rent before Friday, he had been told to report to the executive offices on the top floor. He checked the folded work order again, then glanced toward the row of elevators stretching like silver mirrors along the lobby wall. The signs were confusing, polished so perfectly they reflected the city skyline instead of clear directions. Lily tugged gently on his sleeve. "Daddy, is this the right one?" Ethan smiled the way fathers do when they aren't completely sure but refuse to let worry reach their children. "Looks right to me, sweetheart." The elevator doors opened without a sound. Neither of them noticed the small gold plaque that read executive access only. They simply stepped inside. The doors closed. Outside, 2 security officers looked up almost simultaneously. One frowned. The other reached immediately for his radio. Did that maintenance guy just get on the CEO elevator? Within seconds, several employees turned toward the rising elevator display. Confused whispers drifted across the immaculate lobby like leaves caught in a quiet breeze. Nobody spoke to Ethan because nobody believed he belonged there. Inside the elevator, Lily watched the glowing floor numbers climb higher than she had ever been in a building before. "Wow," she whispered. "It's like we're flying." Ethan laughed softly, grateful for hearing joy, instead of hearing another overdue bill echo inside his thoughts. He had spent 3 years rebuilding a life after losing his wife, taking every honest job he could find, fixing broken lights, repairing heating systems, cleaning mechanical rooms, and promising himself that Lily would never carry the weight of his disappointments. He believed dignity was measured by keeping promises, not by the size of paycheck. The elevator slowed. A gentle chime filled the silent cabin. The doors slid open onto the executive floor, where expensive artwork lined the walls and sunlight poured through towering windows overlooking Manhattan. At that exact moment, another elevator opened across the hallway. Charlotte Hayes, billionaire CEO of Hayes Global, stepped forward surrounded by senior executives. She had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without trembling, faced television cameras without hesitation, and built one of America's fastest-growing companies through relentless discipline. But the instant her eyes landed on Ethan Brooks, every confident step stopped. The leather portfolio slipped from her hand. Her breathing caught. The color quietly drained from her face as though 20 years had vanished in a single heartbeat. She stared at the man standing beside his little girl, unable to speak because she knew that face. And she had spent half her life praying she would see it again. Charlotte Hayes did not hear the questions surrounding her. She did not notice the anxious faces of the executives waiting for instructions or the security officers slowing their approach. Her attention remained fixed on Ethan Brooks, while memories she had buried beneath years of board meetings, quarterly reports, and impossible expectations suddenly rushed back with startling clarity. Ethan, however, had no idea why the most powerful woman in the building was staring at him. He simply tightened his grip on Lily's hand and offered the same polite smile he gave every stranger. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I think we took the wrong elevator." His voice was calm, respectful, completely unaware that every person standing nearby expected the billionaire chief executive officer to demand that security remove him immediately. Instead, Charlotte remained silent. Lily looked up at her father, then at the elegant woman standing across the hallway. "Daddy," she whispered, "is she important?" Ethan leaned down with a gentle smile. "Everyone is important, sweetheart, The simple answer settled over the hallway with unexpected weight. Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. Charlotte swallowed slowly. Those exact words. She had heard them before, long ago, spoken by the same quiet voice under completely different circumstances. Before she could answer, Ethan glanced at the maintenance work order folded inside his hand. "I'm supposed to repair an air conditioning unit on this floor," he explained. "If this is a restricted area, I can leave and wait until someone tells me where I should go." His words carried neither resentment nor embarrassment. He simply respected rules. Charlotte finally found her voice, though it came softer than anyone had ever heard during a corporate meeting. "Who assigned the work order?" Ethan looked surprised by the question. "Building operations, ma'am." "And your name?" "Ethan Brooks." The moment he spoke his full name, Charlotte closed her eyes for the briefest second. There could no longer be any doubt. The years had added a few strands of gray to his hair and quiet lines around his eyes, but kindness had remained untouched. She remembered those same steady eyes looking at a frightened young woman who believed her future had disappeared forever. She remembered someone refusing recognition, refusing money, refusing praise, then quietly walking away before she could even ask his name. Ethan shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the growing silence. Lily noticed first that the woman in front of them looked as though she might cry. Children often recognized emotions adults try to hide. "Are you okay?" Lily asked innocently. Charlotte looked at the little girl, her expression softening in a way that astonished every executive present. "Yes," she answered gently. "I just remembered someone very special." Ethan smiled politely without realizing she was speaking about him. "That is always a good thing," he replied. "The people who show us kindness deserve to be remembered." Charlotte lowered her eyes for a moment, hiding the emotion building inside her. Around them, the hallway remained perfectly still. No one understood why their famously composed chief executive officer seemed unable to continue her morning schedule. Yet deep inside Charlotte, one truth had already become undeniable. Fate had not brought a maintenance worker onto the executive floor by mistake. It had quietly returned the one man she had never been able to thank, and this time she refused to let him disappear before learning the story of the life he had lived after saving hers. Charlotte slowly bent down and picked up the leather portfolio from the polished floor before anyone else could move. She took a careful breath, regaining the calm expression that had earned the respect of investors across the country. Yet something inside her had already changed forever. She looked toward her assistant. "Please postpone the board meeting for 30 minutes. The hallway fell completely silent. Several executives blinked in disbelief. In 10 years, Charlotte Hayes had never delayed a board meeting, not for a snowstorm, not for power outages, not even after spending an entire night negotiating an international merger. Yet this ordinary maintenance worker had somehow become more important than a room filled with billion-dollar decisions. "Ma'am," her chief financial officer asked carefully, believing he had misunderstood. Charlotte answered without taking her eyes off Ethan. 30 minutes. No one questioned her again. Ethan shifted awkwardly. "You really do not have to delay your work because of me," he said. "I can wait downstairs until someone tells me where I should be." Charlotte offered a faint smile that carried more warmth than anyone in the company had ever witnessed. "Mr. Brooks, I believe you are exactly where you are supposed to be." Ethan looked puzzled by the remark, but chose not to argue. Years of raising Lily alone had taught him that not every question needed an immediate answer. Sometimes patience revealed more than curiosity ever could. Lily looked around the elegant hallway, fascinated by paintings that stretched nearly 6 feet across the walls and windows that seemed to touch the clouds. "Daddy," she whispered, "do people really work up here every day?" Ethan nodded softly. "They work just as hard as we do. Different jobs. Same purpose." Charlotte heard every word. Again, she recognized the quiet dignity that had stayed with her through countless difficult years. Most people spoke about success by comparing themselves to others. Ethan spoke about respect without making anyone feel smaller. It was exactly as she remembered. She finally turned toward the executives standing behind her. Please continue reviewing the presentation without me. I will join you shortly. They nodded, although confusion remained written across every face. As the group disappeared into the conference room, Charlotte looked back at Ethan. Would you allow me to show you where the maintenance office is located? Ethan smiled politely. That would be very kind. Thank you. The three of them began walking together through the quiet executive corridor. Security officers stepped aside without being asked. Employees who normally received nothing more than a brief professional nod from the chief executive officer now watched her slowing her pace to match the little girl walking beside her. Lily noticed fresh flowers arranged near the windows. Those are pretty. Charlotte smiled. My mother loved fresh flowers. She believed every office should remind people that life grows best where kindness is planted. Ethan looked toward the bouquet with quiet appreciation. She sounds like she was a wonderful woman. Charlotte lowered her eyes. She was. For a few peaceful moments, none of them spoke again. Only the soft sound of footsteps echoed across the marble floor, while morning sunlight stretched through the glass walls, wrapping the hallway in golden light. Charlotte realized she had spent years searching newspapers, charity records, and old city files for the man who had disappeared before she could thank him. She had almost convinced herself she would never find him. Yet destiny had not brought him back wearing an expensive suit or arriving in a luxury car. It had returned him, exactly as he had always been, carrying responsibility with quiet grace, holding his daughter's hand, asking for nothing, and expecting even less, while remaining completely unaware that the woman walking beside him had never forgotten his face for a single day. The maintenance office occupied a quiet corner behind the executive floor, hidden beyond polished corridors that most visitors never noticed. The room itself was simple, filled with neatly organized tools, spare filters, electrical panels, and the familiar scent of fresh paint mixed with machine oil. Ethan immediately felt more comfortable. Places like this made sense to him because broken things always followed honest rules. If something stopped working, there was always a reason. Charlotte watched as he carefully placed his worn backpack on a workbench before kneeling beside the faulty climate control panel. Within seconds, he stopped reading the service notes and began listening instead. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, hearing the uneven rhythm inside the ventilation system. One of the maintenance supervisors standing nearby raised an eyebrow. You can tell what is wrong just by listening. Ethan smiled modestly. Machines usually tell you what they need if you are patient enough to hear them. He removed the front cover with practiced hands, examined the wiring, then gently tightened a loose connection before replacing a worn sensor that had been vibrating against the housing. Less than 5 minutes later, the air conditioning system settled into a smooth, steady hum. The supervisor stared at the control screen. We have been chasing that problem for almost 3 weeks. Ethan shrugged softly. Sometimes the smallest part makes the biggest difference. Charlotte stood quietly behind him, noticing that he never tried to impress anyone. He simply solved the problem and prepared to move on to the next assignment. Lily wandered toward a nearby window overlooking the Manhattan skyline. She pressed her hands against the glass with quiet amazement. Daddy, everything looks so tiny from up here. Ethan walked over and smiled. Things only look smaller from a distance, sweetheart. That does not mean they matter any less. Charlotte heard the sentence and felt another familiar ache inside her heart. He had always spoken that way, finding simple words that carried deeper truths. Just then, the maintenance supervisor looked at the completed report. Mr. Brooks, this repair saved us from replacing an entire control unit. That would have cost thousands of dollars. Ethan accepted the signed paperwork with a grateful nod. I'm glad we could fix it instead. The supervisor laughed lightly. Most contractors would have recommended replacing the whole system. Ethan carefully returned his screwdriver to the toolbox. Replacing something that still has life left in it should always be the last choice. Charlotte lowered her eyes, realizing he was no longer talking only about machines. Before she could respond, her assistant hurried into the office carrying a tablet. Ma'am, the board is waiting. The investors are becoming concerned. Charlotte looked toward the conference room down the hallway, then back at Ethan. For the first time in many years, a quarterly meeting no longer felt like the most important responsibility on her schedule. "Please tell them I will be there shortly," she replied calmly. The assistant hesitated before nodding and leaving. Ethan noticed the interruption and picked up his backpack. "I appreciate your kindness, but I should not keep you from your work any longer." Charlotte stepped forward almost instinctively. "Mr. Brooks, before you leave, would you allow me to buy you and Lily lunch?" Ethan looked surprised by the unexpected invitation. He glanced down at his daughter, then back at Charlotte with the same quiet humility that had followed him through every difficult season of life. "That is generous," he answered gently, "but I do not think I've done anything special enough to deserve that." Charlotte smiled with emotion she could barely contain because the man who had unknowingly changed her life years ago still believed that ordinary kindness was nothing special at all. Charlotte remained quiet for several long seconds before answering. She had negotiated with presidents, convinced skeptical investors, and spoken before thousands, without searching for the right words. Yet standing in front of Ethan Brooks, she suddenly felt like the uncertain young woman she had once been. "Sometimes," she said gently, "people deserve kindness simply because they have spent their lives giving it away." Ethan smiled politely, although the meaning escaped him. "That is a beautiful way to see the world." Lily looked between the two adults with innocent curiosity. "Daddy always says being nice is free." Charlotte laughed softly, a warm sound that surprised even herself. "Your father is a very wise man." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, slightly embarrassed. "She gives me far more credit than I deserve." Charlotte slowly shook her head. "I do not think she does." The words carried a quiet certainty that Ethan could not explain. Before he could respond, Charlotte led them toward a small private dining room overlooking the city. Unlike the grand executive boardroom nearby, this room felt peaceful, with wooden shelves, fresh flowers, and sunlight stretching across the polished table. A staff member quickly prepared simple sandwiches, soup, fresh fruit, and warm chocolate milk for Lily. Ethan noticed the elegant surroundings and hesitated before sitting. "I hope this is not too much trouble." Charlotte looked at him with genuine sincerity. Some moments are worth making time for. As they began eating, Lily happily spoke about school, her favorite library books, and her dream of becoming an architect because she wanted to design houses where every child could have a window facing the sunrise. Ethan listened with quiet pride, encouraging her without interrupting. Charlotte watched the father and daughter carefully. They did not have expensive clothes or luxury watches. They shared no grand stories about vacations or private schools. Yet every sentence between them carried patience, respect, and affection that could never be purchased. After a while, Charlotte asked softly, "Have you always worked in building maintenance?" Ethan placed his spoon down before answering. "Not always. Years ago, I worked in structural engineering. Smaller projects mostly. Life changed after my wife became ill. After she passed away, I accepted whatever honest work allowed me to stay close to Lily." Charlotte listened without speaking. She noticed he mentioned his loss with gratitude instead of bitterness. There was sadness in his voice, but no anger toward life. "Do you ever miss your old career?" she asked. Ethan looked out the window where sunlight reflected across the glass towers of Manhattan. "Sometimes, but careers can be rebuilt. Childhood cannot. Lily needed her father more than I needed a title." Charlotte lowered her eyes, deeply moved by the quiet conviction behind those words. She remembered countless evenings when she had remained inside her office until midnight, believing success demanded every waking hour. Sitting across from Ethan, she suddenly wondered whether greatness had always looked less like achievement and more like sacrifice. Lily finished her chocolate milk and smiled brightly. "Daddy says we cannot control everything that happens, but we can always choose what kind of people we become." Charlotte felt her heart tighten once again. Those words, that calm wisdom, the same gentle perspective that had once changed the direction of her own life. She looked carefully at Ethan's face, noticing the faint scar near his temple and the kindness that time had never erased. The memories pressing against her heart could no longer remain hidden. She realized the moment she had postponed for 2 decades had finally arrived, and before this lunch ended, She would have to tell Ethan the truth about the day their lives had first crossed, even though he almost certainly had no memory of the frightened young woman he had quietly rescued and then disappeared from without ever asking for recognition. Charlotte rested her hands around the warm cup of coffee without taking a single sip. The sunlight spilling across the table reminded her of another afternoon many years earlier, long before skyscrapers, shareholders, and magazine covers had turned her into one of the most recognizable business leaders in America. She finally lifted her eyes to Ethan. "There is something I have wanted to say for a very long time." Ethan looked at her with quiet curiosity. "Go ahead." Charlotte drew a slow breath. "About 20 years ago, I was a college student in Chicago. My father had just lost everything after his business collapsed. Overnight, we went from living in a large house to sharing a tiny apartment. I believe my future had disappeared." Ethan listened politely, unsure why she was telling him such a personal story. Charlotte continued. "One afternoon, I was standing outside an old engineering library holding a broken box filled with books. The bottom gave way. Everything fell across the sidewalk. Hundreds of people walked past without stopping. I was embarrassed. I wanted to disappear." She smiled faintly through the memory. "Then someone quietly knelt beside me and started picking up every single book without saying a word." Ethan lowered his spoon, his expression thoughtful. Charlotte continued before he could interrupt. "When I apologized for wasting his time, he smiled and said, 'Everyone is important. Sometimes people simply need someone willing to stop walking for a minute.'" Lily's eyes grew wide. "Daddy says that all the time." Ethan blinked once as distant memories slowly returned. "The engineering library," he murmured softly. "There was a young woman carrying far too many textbooks." Charlotte nodded, emotion filling her eyes. "That was me." Ethan leaned back in his chair, surprised. "I never realized." Charlotte smiled gently. "I did not expect you would. After you helped me gather the books, you noticed I had missed an important scholarship interview because everything had scattered across the sidewalk. You looked at your own watch, smiled, and said you still had time before your class. Then you walked me nearly half a mile across campus, so I would not arrive alone." Ethan rubbed his forehead as the forgotten afternoon slowly returned piece by piece. "I remember the interview now. You looked terrified." Charlotte laughed quietly. "I was terrified." Ethan smiled. "I only told you that if the opportunity was truly meant for you, arriving 5 minutes late would not change your worth." Charlotte's eyes glistened. "Those words changed my life. I earned that scholarship. Without it, I could never have finished college. Without college, there would have been no company, no headquarters, no executive office upstairs." Ethan stared at her in complete disbelief. "I only walked with you." "No, Charlotte Gasped. You gave hope to someone who had almost lost it." The room became wonderfully still. Outside the windows, the city continued rushing through another busy afternoon, but inside that quiet dining room, time seemed to pause. Ethan looked down at his hands and shook his head gently. "I honestly believed I was helping someone through a difficult day. I never imagined it mattered after that." Charlotte smiled through grateful tears. "The greatest kindness almost never knows how far it travels. That is why I searched for you for 20 years. I wanted to thank the man who changed my future without asking for my name, without expecting a reward, and without ever realizing that a few ordinary minutes of compassion could echo across an entire lifetime." SUA, for several quiet moments, none of them spoke. The gentle hum of the city outside seemed distant, almost forgotten, while the truth Charlotte had carried for 2 decades settled softly between them. Ethan finally smiled with the same humble warmth that had comforted a frightened college student years before. "I'm grateful everything worked out for you," he said sincerely. "You earned your success. I simply happened to be walking in the same direction." Charlotte slowly shook her head. "You still do not understand." Ethan looked at her with quiet curiosity. "Help me understand, then." Charlotte reached into her portfolio and carefully placed a small, worn photograph on the table. It showed a much younger version of herself standing in front of a university building, smiling while holding a scholarship certificate. Standing beside her was a young man carrying a backpack over one shoulder, looking almost embarrassed to be included in the picture. Ethan stared at the photograph for several seconds before laughing softly. I forgot someone insisted. Charlotte had barely returned to the executive conference room when the atmosphere changed. The calm discussions that normally filled the space had been replaced by tense voices, worried expressions, and presentation screens flashing warning messages. Her chief technology officer stood beside the large display with visible concern. "We have a serious problem," he said. "The environmental control network in Building 4 has failed. If we cannot stabilize the system before the investors begin touring the research center this afternoon, several demonstration laboratories will have to close temporarily." The room grew silent. Millions of dollars in future partnerships depended on the visit. Engineers had already examined the system remotely without finding a solution. Replacement components would not arrive until the following morning. One executive suggested postponing the tour. Another proposed moving the demonstrations to another campus. Every idea created new complications. Charlotte listened carefully before asking one simple question. "Has anyone physically inspected the equipment?" The room became quiet again. Remote diagnostics had replaced old-fashioned observation years ago. No one had considered walking into the mechanical room. At that moment, Charlotte remembered Ethan kneeling beside the faulty air conditioning unit earlier that morning, listening before touching a single tool. Without hesitation, she stood. "Bring Mr. Brooks back before he leaves the building." Several executives exchanged puzzled glances, but no one argued. Downstairs, Ethan and Lily were preparing to leave through the main lobby when a young assistant hurried toward them. Slightly out of breath, she smiled apologetically. "Mr. Brooks, Ms. Hayes hopes you might have a few more minutes." Ethan looked at the clock. His next maintenance assignment was not scheduled for another hour. "Of course," he answered politely. Minutes later, he stood inside the conference room, surrounded by senior executives wearing tailored suits and expensive watches. Ethan immediately felt out of place. Charlotte greeted him with a grateful smile. "I know this is an unusual request, but would you mind looking at a mechanical issue before we make an expensive decision?" Ethan nodded without hesitation. "I can certainly try." When they arrived at Building 4, Ethan entered the mechanical room carrying nothing more than a flashlight and a small tool bag. The ventilation units produced an uneven vibration that echoed softly through the concrete walls. Instead of opening the control panel immediately, he stood quietly with his eyes closed, listening. One executive whispered to another, "What is he doing?" Charlotte answered without looking away. "He is paying attention." After nearly a minute, Ethan walked toward an older section of copper piping that had been installed years before the latest renovations. He rested one hand against the pipe, then smiled gently. "The computers are searching in the wrong place," he said. "The problem is not electronic. It is mechanical." He removed a small inspection panel and discovered that a pressure balancing valve had become partially obstructed, forcing the entire system to compensate in ways the software could not correctly interpret. The repair required less than 15 minutes and a replacement part that was already sitting and used on a nearby maintenance shelf. Slowly, the vibration disappeared. The monitors throughout the room turned from warning red to steady green. Fresh air flowed smoothly through the building once again. The engineers stared at the screens in disbelief. One of them quietly admitted, "We were preparing to spend almost $200,000 replacing equipment that never needed replacing." Ethan simply wiped his hands with a clean cloth and smiled. Sometimes technology answers complicated questions. Sometimes experience notices simple ones. Charlotte looked around the room at the executives whose expressions had changed completely. For the second time that day, the most valuable lesson inside Hayes Global had not come from wealth, influence, or advanced software. It had come from a quiet father who never stopped believing that the smallest details, like the smallest acts of kindness, could change everything. The investor tour began exactly on schedule that afternoon, and not a single guest ever realized how close Hayes Global had come to an embarrassing delay. Laboratories remained comfortable. Demonstrations proceeded flawlessly, and by sunset the company had secured one of the largest research partnerships in its history. Applause echoed through the executive conference room as the agreement was finalized. But Charlotte knew the true reason behind that success, had already packed his toolbox and quietly prepared to leave. She asked everyone to remain seated for one final announcement. "Before we celebrate today's achievement," she began, "there is someone I would like all of you to meet properly." The conference room doors opened, and Ethan stepped inside holding Lily's hand, looking as uncomfortable as if he had wandered into the wrong place once again. Several executives smiled warmly, this time instead of staring with uncertainty. Charlotte walked toward him without hesitation. "This morning many of us judged a man by his worn jacket instead of his character," she said. "We assumed titles measured wisdom. Today we learned something much more valuable." She turned toward Ethan. 20 years ago, this man changed my life with a few minutes of kindness. Today he quietly saved this company from making a costly mistake without asking for recognition, praise, or reward. The greatest leaders I have ever met were not the loudest people in the room. They were the ones who made everyone around them better." The room fell into complete silence before applause slowly filled the air. Ethan looked genuinely embarrassed. He waited patiently until the applause faded before speaking. "Thank you for your generous words," he said softly. "But I only did what anyone should do when they have the chance to help." Charlotte smiled. "That is exactly why you deserve every word." She then placed a single folder on the conference table. "Last time I offered you a position because I felt grateful. You respectfully declined because you believed opportunities should be earned. So today I'm offering something different." Ethan looked at her with quiet curiosity. Charlotte continued, "Our engineering leadership committee has unanimously recommended creating a new role focused on mentoring maintenance teams, improving facilities, and training future engineers through practical experience. Every member voted after watching your work today. This opportunity was not created because of our past. It was created because of what you demonstrated in front of all of us." Ethan slowly opened the folder. Inside were evaluation reports signed by department heads, technical recommendations, and an official employment offer supported by the entire executive team. He looked around the room and saw sincere respect instead of sympathy. After a long, thoughtful pause, he smiled. "In that case," he said quietly, "I would be honored to accept." Lily threw her arms around her father, her joyful laughter filling the room with the kind of happiness that no business contract could ever equal. Months later, the maintenance division became one of the most respected departments in the company, not because Ethan demanded perfection, but because he treated every employee with the same dignity he had always shown strangers. Charlotte often joined him for lunch, and their friendship slowly grew into something built on trust, gratitude, and shared values rather than wealth or status. Whenever new employees asked why the chief executive officer always smiled when she walked past the maintenance office, she simply answered, "Because every great building stands on a strong foundation, and so does every meaningful life." And if anyone ever wondered how one ordinary father could change so many lives, the answer was always the same. Kindness offered without expecting anything in return never disappears. It simply waits, sometimes for years, until the right elevator door opens and reminds the world that true greatness has always traveled quietly.